this is work that I did as part of Mark Maneri's group in Malawi over the last few years. Many of you thought I was gone or dead or hoped one of those things, but I wasn't. I was in Malawi. Let me use this thing. So Mark touched on this a little bit about malnutrition as such a big cause of childhood mortality. We don't have a good way of measuring how big of a cause it is, how big of an underlying cause it is, because it's easier for us to measure things like your respiratory rate and say you died of pneumonia, or measure your viral load and said you died of HIV, or do a blood smear and see that you have malarial parasites. But underlying all of that, depending on who you ask or how much you count, a third to a half of children, their deaths could be prevented if they were in a better nutritional state in one form or another. So the forms I'm going to talk about today is this sort of combination cluster of syndromes called marasmus and kwashiorkor, and they sort of cluster together called severe acute malnutrition. So marasmus is something that we've maybe think about stereotypically about what a severely malnourished child looks like. They're wasted away, they're profoundly emaciated, sort of the classical things. And then the other form is kwashiorkor, which is not unique, but very predominant in southern Africa compared to the rest of the world especially. And I think Dr. Gordon will probably tell you more about kwashiorkor in his talk. And this is a very strange, unexplained, poorly understood form of malnutrition where children really have a lot of capillary leak. They become diffusely edematous. They have skin breakdown. They have profound neurological impairment along the way. And a decade or more ago, Mark did great work really changing the way that the severe acute malnutrition, both forms, marasmus and kwashiorkor, were managed. Instead of being managed in an inpatient setting with fortified milk-based therapies, he's really revolutionized the way that this is treated now into an outpatient form of management using essentially a fortified peanut butter. And this map is a little old. They need to update this. This now can be made all over the world in local settings. And in local factories. And so this really brings the therapy to the communities that need it, and in a way that actually proves to be far more effective than bringing children into the hospital. Using this home-based therapy is really the way that care is done now. And the other really profound thing about this is that not only is the outcomes better for any given child you randomize, you can actually get this therapy to far more children by bringing it to the village. This is a friend of ours in one of the villages we work in who's a local village health aide. He's got a 10th grade education. He's had 2 months of medical training, and he's the town's doctor, essentially. So he's identifying and treating malnourished children. And this is really the new way that malnutrition is treated in most of the world. So that's the sort of background that I'm working in. So what can we do to get better? So we're not at 100%. Not all of these kids are surviving. It's not working. There's a small percentage left, 10%, 15%, who don't recover from this. But when we're talking about a disease that hits 20 to 25 million kids a year, anything we can do to improve 10 or 15% is an important thing. So going back, if we looked at how severe malnutrition was managed in the earlier days in inpatient settings with fortified milk-based formulas, there was a realization that these children were often infected with other things. Like I said, they die of pneumonia or diarrhea or these measles, these sort of things. And so there was a long thought given that antibiotics should be given to all of these children. And this came out of the very high quality thing known as expert opinion. There was no evidence behind this. There was just a bunch of people sitting around drinking red wine in a meeting room in Geneva at the WHO and decided this was the way things needed to be done. But this was the dogma. And then, when the community switched to outpatient management of malnutrition, the dogma sort of persisted, but it was sort of a little bit looser, some sort of a short oral course. It wasn't really very clear why. And no one really believed it, but people were sort of afraid, I think, to take this out. And this leads to, some confusion because it's not strong and evidence-based, and it also leads to a lot of practical difficulties because this is not a cheap disease to fix. This are, like I said, millions of kids getting it. So anything you can do to lower the cost of these therapies is really important, and the complexity. These are not sophisticated healthcare workers in the village that are doing this. So we set about trying to figure out, is this really needed? So we did a first pass thing where we went one step above expert opinion, and we did a retrospective sort of chart review. And to see if this was essential, if this was really necessary. So we looked at some of the feeding clinics that we operate in Malawi, where we didn't routinely give antibiotics. Didn't really seem like that was necessary, compared to those in another part of Malawi, in central Malawi, where they did. And it turned out that the recovery rates, if you gave amoxicillin, were much worse, actually, without antibiotics early on at 4 weeks. By about 12 weeks, they were about the same. But it didn't really seem to benefit children early on. It made them potentially require the therapeutic food longer. And you can play all sorts of cool statistical games, and this really did survive in a regression analysis also, where children who received amoxicillin were not likely to do as well early on, but were okay by the end of the therapy. So we had expert opinion saying give this. We had retrospective trial data saying don't give it. And then we had review articles that said do an RCT. Large RCTs are needed to figure this out. This is out of the WHO. These are some people who are, Andre Brienne, people who developed these therapeutic foods, said that, we need to do RCTs. So Mark said, okay, Indi, I'm going to banish you to Africa and do an RCT. So we did one. And so the design of this study that I'll tell you the data about was taking our sort of classic population of severely malnourished children, kids with marasmus and kwashiorkor, in the sort of highest peak age range, the 6 months to 5-year-old age range, who qualify for community-based therapy. So these are children who have enough of an appetite, who have enough of a mental status that they can be treated at home, which really is 98 or 99% of the children with severe malnutrition. It's not a small percentage of them. They had either kwash or marasmus. They were near one of the clinics. Can't study people that aren't near you. You can't find them. We didn't really exclude a lot of children, just a few small exceptions. We didn't test them for HIV or TB. We just said, all comers, this is a real world sort of trial. If you have HIV, you're going to have HIV even when the trial's over. So we're not going to limit you from there. The sort of standard group was to give them placebo, but then we tried 2 different intervention groups, giving one group amoxicillin, one group ceftonir, randomized them, blinded. The mothers are blinded, the nurses in the clinic are blinded. We did all the data analysis blinded, all that sort of thing. And we were looking at a few primary outcomes. This is sort of a drug study, if you will. So adverse effects, we had to sort of go through the Malawian version of the FDA, so of course they were interested in that. And then the real clinical things, we were interested in nutritional recovery, how many of them reversed their kwashiorkor, how many of them gained enough weight to get out of the marasmic state. And then a good friend of ours in Kenya, Jay Berkeley, said, well, how many of them died? That's all I care about. And duh. So mortality was our other primary outcome. The secondary outcomes look like they got cut off. So those are mostly growth outcomes. How much weight did they gain? How much height did they gain? What was their MUAC? Their arm circumference gain, these sort of things. So we did some sample size analyses and wanted to do this trial with 900 children in each group based upon previous data we had on how many children recover, how many children die. So over the course of about 13 months, we enrolled a little more than 900 children in each group, 2,700 and some children total. And this is the sort of table 1 of how do these children look. And they look very similar, very classic to the children that we were interested in studying. So our randomization, our recruitment sort of worked. They're all just over a year and a half, just under 12 plus 6, just over a year and a half. Like I said, the population in Southern Africa is a mostly kwashiorkor population, 70%, about 20% marasmus, and about almost 10% actually were the really sick ones that had both forms of this. A very stunted population, as Mark sort of alluded to in his talk about enteropathy. The mean height for age Z-score is 3 or more standard deviations below. We didn't test HIV in any of them. We sort of asked if they had been tested and sort of encouraged some of the sicker ones to get tested. So we have sort of incomplete data on HIV testing. And then the randomization sort of worked. And then so the sort of first outcome of safety data, we were very concerned that if you give these children an antibiotic, they're going to have more diarrhea, they're going to have rashes. People always ask about drug allergies, these sort of things. And we didn't really seem to have any of that. So how many of the children actually took all 7 days of intervention as sort of a crude marker of how tolerable, how palatable it was? And we had fantastic compliance or adherence. We didn't, cause any fevers, not surprising. We didn't cause any coughs. In fact, we may have decreased the rates of coughing. We didn't cause any increase in diarrhea. In fact, children who got amoxicillin or ceftonir actually had lower rates of diarrhea. Nobody really vomited it. No rashes that we were concerned that might be a drug reaction. So sort of it was safe in that sense. We didn't create any damage that we were worried about. And so, okay, so this is a busy table. So if we had 924 children who got amoxicillin, 923 that got ceftonir, and 920 that got placebo, and looking at how many of them did not recover. So about 11% of the children who got amoxicillin did not recover, 9% with ceftonir, and almost 15% with placebo. The sort of relative risk of that is 1.32 times more likely to not recover if you got placebo. 1.6 times more likely to not recover if you got placebo compared to ceftonir. There was a trend to ceftonir being more effective than amoxicillin. And if you combine either of these antibiotics together, you're about a 1.46 times more likely to not recover. So what's happening to these children that don't recover? Well, most of the time they're just dying. Almost 5% died with amoxicillin, about 4% with ceftonir, and 7.5% with placebo. So your relative risk of death is 1.5 times higher if you got placebo instead of amox, 1.8 times higher if you got ceftonir. Either antibiotic combined, 1.66 times higher. And this trend that these antibiotics were helpful was there even if you break it down by different forms of malnutrition, kwashiorkor marasmic, kwash, and marasmus. These are trends, they weren't statistically significant necessarily because we weren't powered to do that. You know, we had relatively small numbers of children with the different types. So what is a relative risk, right? I still don't understand what a relative risk is. To think about it the way I think about it more easily, if you were going to die, let's say death, if you were going to die and with placebo, you could save 35% of those deaths if you gave amoxicillin, 44% if you gave ceftonir. If you weren't going to recover, you're talking about a 25 to 38% increase in the recovery rate. Secondary outcomes, I was telling you about growth parameters for the most part, were consistent with these primary outcomes. That's always nice. It sort of feeds into Cook's postulates or something. The weight gain was better if you got ceftonir and placebo. The mid-upper arm circumference, which is a measure of sort of your lean body mass, was better if you got these antibiotics. Your time to recovery was about the same. And then this was, again, consistent between the three different types. If you look at a survival curve of how long it takes to recover, you do recover faster also if you get if you got amoxicillin, and even faster if you got ceftonir. These graphs don't look very different, but when you play with large numbers, they statistically work out to be quite nice. And the time to death also. So, you know, if you were going to die with one of the antibiotics, you at least survive longer, potentially giving you the chance to get to a healthcare facility. And then again, in a regression analysis, sort of what are the things that are more likely to make you not recover or more likely to lead to your death? Sort of things that you could expect. You know, if you're younger, you're more likely to die. If you have the most severe form, the marasmic kwashiorkor, you're more likely to die. The more stunted you are to start with, you're more likely to die. HIV, you know, bad respiratory infection. But then, you know, in terms of what can we actually do in an intervention, the antibiotics did survive in the regression analysis as being strongly linked to nutritional recovery and survival. And this was a table that got relegated to the appendix because we weren't powered to do these, and these were sort of post hoc analyses of different subcategories of children. So we take all children 6 to 59 months old with all three forms of severe malnutrition. What if we break it down by different age groups or different amount of stunting, HIV status, these sort of things. And so again, these are all subgroup analyses, so the power isn't there for all of them, but the trend is pretty clear. On this graph, this is nutritional recovery. The trend is pretty clear. No matter how you break it down, antibiotics are helpful. And then similarly for mortality, antibiotics are helpful across essentially all of these subcategories. So we set out to show that this wasn't going to, we're not set out to show that. We sort of had a hypothesis that these weren't going to help. We were shocked and surprised that they did. Now I think you know, this is sort of an example of how Mark's sort of work is really changing the real world effectiveness of this. The new WHO guidelines are going to again emphasize this with more clear dosing regimens and sort of grade 1A randomized trial evidence. This is the fantastic team of nurses and researchers in Malawi. Thank you all for paying your taxes. It's paid my rent for a while. And Mark's research group is fantastic. Thanks. Questions?
How long are these children breastfed?
I would say that so at 20 months, let's say I can give you actual numbers, and then I'll give you my gestalt. So the average child in the study was 20 months old, and 70% of them are still breastfeeding. It's probably typical for 2.5, 3 years old to still be breastfeeding. Essentially, they'll breastfeed until you have the next baby, or your 3 to 4 would probably be an artificial stop point if there was no new baby coming along.
Are you looking at the nutrition of the mothers?
No. No, we didn't measure the mothers and how wasted they were or stunted they were. Dr. Storch, I'm always afraid of your questions.
Just a general question. How do you handle the massive amount of data you must have had in the setting?
We have great students that like to punch data into computers. It's actually not that much data. It's measuring, on any given day, there were probably, in the busiest day in the rainy season and the hungry season, maybe there's 100 children enrolled in the study at a time. And most days there's, 20 or 30. So the measurements, the data, this is a really crude study. All we did was measure their height, weight, pushed on their feet to see if they were edematous. So it's not a lot of data per child times 30 children to enter into a database at the end of the night. It's not too bad.
So, Indi, I've heard this description that I'm going to ask you to convey to the audience before, but would you please spend a few minutes and describe to the audience where your clinical research base is and what goes on an average day? Because I think most of us don't have an appreciation for what it's like to actually conduct that study.
I swear I didn't plant him. He comes to this every year. This is, so the research base is set up in Blantyre, Malawi. It's the commercial capital. It's the New York of Malawi. In southern Malawi, there's a stock exchange. They have 4 stocks that they trade on the entire stock exchange. It's a city of 500,000 to 1 million people, depending on how far out you want to call the suburbs. And so they're sort of based there. And then surrounding there, if you drive half an hour in any given direction, you'll hit extraordinarily rural people, subsistence farmers. You live and work on this plot of land your entire life. Maybe you'll go to the street to where the tarmac meets to sell your tomatoes, but it's a real small sort of circle of subsistence farming population. So we go out to these villages, and we try to go out to villages that are even farther from the road than that. We don't sort of want Western influence. We want the sort of real life, rural Africa. And so we have 18 villages. The number sort of changes depending on the study. For this study, we had 18 villages in 6 districts surrounding there that are all an hour to 3 hours away. And so we're out in the morning at 5 or 5:30, driving through the countryside, seeing these places. Lots of muddy roads in the rainy season, lots of cars breaking down, lots of cars getting stuck in the mud. And these villages that we go to, we use these village health centers that over the years, Mark's developed this great relationship with the Ministry of Health to say, hey, we'll run your malnutrition clinics, or you're the Ministry of Health, it's your job to provide this health care. We'll do it for you. We'll bring the food, we'll bring the nurses, we'll bring the staff. It'll save you money, and while we're there, we'll collect some data. So this is a sort of typical village health center. And the mothers in the village there, we work with the local health aides to tell them, okay, Tuesday is malnutrition day. The people from Blantyre are coming to get everything set up. So they'll spread the word. Any mother that's worried about her child, any mother that's come in the last week or two to the village, to the village clinic, and the health aide there noticed that their child looks particularly small, that sort of thing. They're sort of there. They're set up, waiting for, to be screened for malnutrition, to be identified, to be given therapeutic food, to be taught how to give the food, and then potentially to be enrolled in the study. They hate sitting on these naked sitting on these little scales. They try to jump off these scales. They have no good sense of height, these kids. This is Lacey LeGrone, one of our great med students. They just graduated from here last year. They hate being measured, like I said. And it's really crude. It's like I was telling Dr. it's really crude, simple things. Are you of the right height and weight? Lots and lots of edema. The kwashiorkor there is quite bad. And so this is the very fancy IRB-approved consenting process. Children that are identified as being malnourished that seem to qualify for our study, their mothers will sort of set them aside. Their mothers will gather up and do a sort of group consent. There's no written consent. Our nurses, these are 2 of our great nurses, will explain what the process involves. They'll get a thumbprint. There's no literacy, that they sort of agree. Everyone agrees. I've had in 3 years there and running a couple big studies, one mother refused, and she was just honest. She said, I can't walk back just for your data, and so she refused. But an amazing population. The kids get screened, they get fed. You might see this picture in Jeff's talk too. They get their supply of food for a couple of weeks. They go home, they come back, get rescreened. Is their weight recovered? Are they having any side effects? All that sort of stuff. It's an adventure being there. You can flip over cars your first week that you're there, proving that seatbelts do save lives. This is the very fancy data entry process, just laptops and data cards. This is the very fancy data entry process with official beverages of research. And then you do it again the next day. I don't know, is that what you meant? That's not paid for by NIH money. It's Bill Gates money. Dr. Singh. The children that died, what did they die of? We don't know for sure what they died of. So we do a sort of verbal autopsy where we ask the mothers what were the sort of symptoms that they had when they died, and some of them will be very clear. Maybe they've gone to the health center and they've died there and they have some sort of diagnosis in their medical book, or they've gone to the hospital and they've died, or we sort of make it up based upon the symptoms. Oh, they had the worst diarrhea ever and they were pooping out their brains, and so we can say they died of diarrhea. Or they were extremely febrile and they were seizing and arching back. Well, maybe they had malaria, these sort of things. And I think the distribution, we did look at what our sort of clinical guess was based upon these verbal autopsies, and it's very similar to the things that they always die. There's measles, malaria, pneumonia, diarrhea. This study was conducted in the middle of a measles outbreak. I don't know if that's true. He's saying that most of the kids with quash will die of cardiac arrest from a sudden electrolyte imbalance. I don't think so. I think if you put a feeding tube down someone's nose and give them an NG tube and you pump them full of electrolytes and high fortified milk, then maybe. But this outpatient therapy is sort of a demand-driven thing. The child will eat to their appetite. So they actually start out a little bit slow the first couple days. Maybe by day 3 to 5, they realize that their appetite comes back a little more. They eat a ton, and then they sort of slow down as they sort of recover. I don't know if that's true. Mark.
Yeah, I mean, when we've done other studies with, trying to figure out why kids die, and we're intensively measuring them, over half of them will have a positive blood culture or a positive urine culture collected sterilely, growing Klebsiella or E. coli. 15% will have really profoundly low serum phosphorus. I mean, profoundly low, and about 50% would have a history that would be suggestive of cardiac failure.
Let's take one more and then we'll do the rest of the coffee break.
Was splenomegaly a risk factor for death in either the treated or the untreated groups? Splenomegaly as a surrogate for malaria?
Didn't check. Fever was not. In terms of, to answer the malaria question, was splenomegaly a risk factor for death? Didn't check.
Indi will answer questions over coffee, I'm sure. Let's thank the whole set of speakers again.